All right, good afternoon. I think we can go ahead and get started. Hopefully people have been able to sign on. Thank you so much for joining us. For those I haven't met, my name is Janine Benner and I'm the director of the Oregon Department of Energy. I really appreciate those of you who are tuning in today to learn more about ODOE's agency request budget for the 2023-2025 biennium. So today I'll start by giving some brief remarks, and then I will turn it over to Michael Williams, our Assistant Director for Central Services, to share information on our budget. And he and I will both take questions throughout, and we also have a number of other ODOE staff on the line to answer questions as well. So first, a few housekeeping items. We are holding this meeting today as a WebEx event, which means that ODOE staff are panelists and presenters, and everyone else is an attendee. At this point, I'd like to ask the ODOE staff on the line to please introduce themselves in the chat, and I'd also invite everyone else to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Feel free to tell us your name and if there's an energy supplier or organization that you're representing today. I'd also like to take a moment to share the community agreements on this slide, which we adopted from a statewide diversity, equity, and inclusion training that a number of our staff took, and we think are helpful to ground us before we begin the conversation. Hopefully most of you have participated in virtual meetings before, and this should be a review. Here's a quick primer on how to use WebEx. As attendees today, you won't be able to unmute your microphone or turn on your camera, but you are welcome to raise your hand for us to call on you or use the chat function to ask questions and communicate with the ODOE team. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please use the chat box and select your chat to go to all panelists. That means it will go to the entire ODOE team who's on the line. We'll be monitoring that chat, and we will either respond to or raise the questions to the presenter. If you raise your hand and we call on you to ask a question, the host will unmute you and then you will be able to speak. For those of you who are on the phone, you can press *6 to raise your hand and *3 to unmute yourself when we call on you. Finally, we will also be monitoring the askenergy@oregon.gov email inbox if you would prefer to email your questions. And we will try to do this in real time, but the state has a pretty good spam filter that might mean it takes us a while to get your email. So you're also welcome to send questions to that email address if they occur to you after the meeting is over. Again, that's askenergy@oregon.gov, and I'll ask my colleague Jenny to put that link in the chat for you. So finally, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Oregon Department of Energy, what you see on this slide is our mission and what we do. We help Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable, clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. On the bottom half of this slide, you can see the ways in which we do the work to achieve this mission. The agency request budget you'll hear about today represents the resources we think we need to be successful in meeting this mission and doing this work. So for those of you who don't live and breathe state agency budgets like Michael and me, just a quick reminder on how the process works. What we're presenting to you today is ODOE's Agency Request Budget, or ARB. This budget was developed according to the process prescribed by the state. It happens the same way every biennium, and started with a current service level budget, an estimate of continuing to administer legislatively approved programs into the next biennium. To that CSL, we add policy option packages, or POPs, which provide additional resources to the agency to enable us to do our work. Like all agencies, we are also required to submit a list identifying possible budget reductions to the current service level when we submit our budget. We will submit all of this to the Department of Administrative Services on July 31st. The materials we will present to you today, which are also on our website, and I think Jenny has already put a link in the chat, but you can find them by going to About Us in the top menu bar and clicking on Budget. They demonstrate how we arrive at our agency request budget, what the money is used for, how our programs and activities are funded, and what the projections are for the energy supplier assessment if the legislature chooses to adopt this budget. We're going to walk through our budget program by program. Please feel free to ask questions during the presentation. Again, submit them through the chat to all panelists or raise your hand. And we'll also try to leave time for questions at the end. If there's any additional information that you'd like to see about our budget that isn't covered in this presentation, please ask. We would be happy to provide you whatever we can and as much information as you'd like about our budget. Last month, we presented our current service level budget and our draft proposed policy option packages to our Energy Advisory Work Group members. So thanks so much to those of you who participated in that conversation and offered feedback. Some of what we will talk about today will be a repeat for EAWG members, but this presentation will go into greater detail on the agency request budget. As a reminder, the agency is required to hold this meeting by ORS 469-421, which states that, quote, prior to filing an agency request budget, the director shall convene a public meeting with representatives of energy resource suppliers and other interested parties for the purpose of providing energy resource suppliers with a full accounting of the projected revenue needed to fund each department, program, or activity, and the projected allocation of monies derived from the assessment to each department, program, or activity. So I'm going to introduce Michael Williams in just a minute, but for those of you who may not be able to stay for the whole meeting or who just want to cut right to the chase, I wanted to go over some key takeaways which are on this slide. And first, I'd like to acknowledge the uncertainty that all agencies are facing as we put together our budgets. The economic and political outlooks are especially uncertain, and both will end up having a significant effect on the budget that the legislature ultimately passes for ODOE. A lot can change between now and next June, which is when the 2023 legislative session will wrap up and our budget will be final. With all the uncertainty, our approach to the budget this year was to ask for what we think we need to be able to do a better job preparing the state for the clean energy transition, for helping maintain a resilient and affordable energy system in the face of such change and uncertainty. This budget requests additional resources to help meet needs or fill gaps in our ability to help the state achieve a safe, equitable, clean, and sustainable energy future. Some are new and some are needs that we've identified for biennia. The additional resources we're asking for will help us get better information and present it clearly. They will enable us to continue to run programs that bring down the costs of clean energy and energy efficiency for consumers. They will help us process applications for energy projects in a timely way. They'll promote equity within the agency and enable us to help communities all around the state benefit from the clean energy transition. And we recognize that the next governor and legislature may choose not to fund all of this, but we're erring on the side of transparency here on our needs so that decision makers have the information and you have the information you need to share your thoughts with us and the incoming governor and legislature. Our agency request budget incorporates changes from what we presented to the EAWG last month based on their feedback. And as we go through our policy option packages, we'll share how we've worked to reduce the effect on the energy supplier assessment. Again, we'll share more details on this as we go through the presentation, but I know many of you are curious about the ESA. So if the agency request budget were adopted as proposed, the ESA for the next biennium would be $16.7 million, which is about 6.7% higher than this biennium. Now, I know you probably have a lot of questions about these, and hopefully Michael will answer them during the next hour, but I will pause right now just in case someone has a general question before we get into the details. I am not seeing any questions. Ruchi, are you seeing any questions in the chat or raised hands?
Nope, I'm not seeing any either. But we can give people another second to see. Anyone? Nope, I don't see anything.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sure you will have some questions once Michael gets started. So Michael, go ahead.
Thank you, Janine, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Williams, Assistant Director for Central Services. Before we dive into the budget, I wanted to familiarize you with some terms that you will see throughout this presentation. Personal services includes things like salary, retirement payments, and healthcare related to employee compensation costs. Services and supplies include the equipment, facilities, supplies, and contracted services that we need to administer the program. Special payments are expenditures for which a department isn't the primary beneficiary. Examples of that would be incentive payments or payments to other agencies. And debt service is what we spend on principal, interest, and premiums related to debt from our small scale energy loan program and efficiency loan program, both of which are inactive. Next slide. So this slide is probably familiar to those of you who attended the budget meeting in prior years. It's a timeline for the steps the agency completes to develop the agency request budget that will be submitted to the governor and the Department of Administrative Services on August 1st. The process for creating the agency request budget begins with the legislatively approved budget for July 1st, 2021 to June 30, 2023. We then adjust for cost of living adjustments and merit step increases. These costs are determined by the Oregon Department of Administrative Services for all state agencies, and ODOE and this becomes our base budget. We then need to make several adjustments to the base budget to determine the current service level budget, which is the amount needed to administer the legislatively approved programs in the next biennium. The current service level budget was submitted to the state CFO's office on May 31st and presented to the Energy Advisor Work Group in June. Again, how most of these figures are calculated were determined by the Department of Administrative Services and current legislation. And in this step, I wanted to particularly call out the phase in and phase out process, where we need to remove programs or resources that were only provided funding in the current biennium, even if the program is anticipated to continue into the next biennium, as you will see with most of our incentive programs. We then add our policy option packages to the current service level to arrive at our agency request budget that we'll be discussing today. And that will be submitted to the CFO's office next week. And then, as Janine mentioned, it's important to note that the governor's recommended budget will be released in early 2023. And in this cycle, there will be a new governor who may take further adjustments before presenting the budget to the legislature. We won't know the agency's actual budget until it is approved by the legislature, which could be as late as June 2023. The budget process is iterative with many places where things can change, and we will do our best to keep you informed with the best information we can provide throughout this process. Next slide. So a couple of adjustments to the base budget here. Personal services, again, was related to employee compensation, and there were a few significant adjustments that happened in the 2021-23 biennium that affect the 23-25 base budget. This includes cost of living and merit step increases, which were negotiated by the governor and which generally take place every biennium and are then built into the following base budget. During the 21-23 biennium, ODOE was able to absorb these increased costs using program savings and reserves and able to avoid an increase in the 2022 energy supplier assessment and help provide rate stability. We also phased out limited duration positions statutorily scheduled to end. Most of these positions will be phased back in by policy option packages. Phase out related to positions happens in the base budget. Other program costs that need to be phased out happen at the current service level phase. So moving to the current service level budget, which represents what it would take to continue our programs that are currently approved by the legislature for the next biennium. To develop the current service level budget, we phase out the program costs that aren't approved for the next biennium, make any adjustments to the from the short session that would impact the next biennium, and adjust for inflation and account for any fund shifts. You can see from this slide that we had to phase out incentive programs that require additional legislative action to continue into the next biennium. The inflation figures you see here are provided by DAS, and all executive are provided by DAS to ODOE and all executive branch agencies as part of the budget instructions. Finally, the fund shift is for funding we received from USDOE related to the Energy Security Plan. Okay, well now we'll go through a series of slides breaking down the agency request budget. the ARB is created when we add our policy option packages to the current service level budget. While these slides may look the same as the ones presented at the Energy Advisor Work Group in June, they are different and reflect the changing phases of the budget process. These graphs show ODOE's agency request budget for the 23-25 biennium by division, by program division within the department. On the left side, you'll see ODOE's budget less internal general fund transfers, which I'll talk about in a moment, and is dominated by the small scale energy loan program and incentive payments in the Energy Development Services Division. We are excited to once again be offering incentives that produce renewable energy and lower the cost, of energy for Oregonians. And on the SELP side, it's an inactive program, and it's fairly transactional, where borrowers make payments for the loans and we turn around and use that revenue to pay off the debt service on the bonds. So on the right side, you'll see the operating budget for the department. This does not include debt service payments in the SELP program or the special payments or incentive monies that we distribute, but instead represents what it costs to run the agency. The operating budget is essentially personal services and supplies to administer ODOE's programs and day-to-day operations. So here's another chart that will be familiar to many of you and has been updated for the upcoming biennium. It is a 10-year look back at our agency's budget. We did make a small change to this chart that we think provides better clarity on ODOE's budget. As I mentioned in the previous slide, when ODOE receives general fund dollars for a specific purpose, those funds need to be transferred into an account in order to be spent. This is a technical accounting adjustment, is an internal fund transfer, and makes ODOE's budget seem bigger than it is. This happens essentially when we receive general fund in the Energy Development Services Division, which was something that is relatively new to ODOE. And it's the clear pink outline bar that you see in this graph. And for reference, on some of the other ones, the other funds non-limited represents our self-bonding authority, which was phased out when the program stopped actively lending, as you can see from the 2017-19 biennium to the 19-21 biennium. Other funds debt services also show a non-limited debt service shows the agency still has to repay the bonds and service the loans that were issued before the program stopped lending and represents a sizable portion of our budget. The light blue and purple bands are also related to debt service from lottery funds. The top light green bar represents federal funds that the agency receives, such as the State Energy Program and the Hanford Grant. While federal funds remain steady over the last several years, we anticipate a significant increase in federal funds in the next biennium because of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. While we know ODOE will be receiving these funds, they have not yet been awarded, and so we can't include it in our ARB, in our agency request budget. So we have divided other funds into two categories: expenditures that were or are projected to be supported with the energy supplier assessment, which is the orange bar, and the balance of other fund expenditures that were budgeted using fees for services, grants, and the indirect rate, which is the maroon bar. Sorry, I think we're still on the, yeah. The pink represents general fund. ODOE did receive general fund in 2019. You can see a little bit then, but you can see it's a relatively small portion of the budget, which has grown in the 21-23 and continues into the 23-25 biennium, and represents a diversification of the agency's funding streams, which is something we have sought. Next slide, please. While this meeting is focused on the impacts of the energy supplier assessment, ESA is just one of ODOE's funding sources. Diversifying our funding streams allows ODOE to reduce our reliance on the energy supplier assessment. Each type of fund has a specific purpose or function that determines how it can be used. And here you see our federal funds, the supplier assessment, self-revenue, general fund. The ESA is the primary way the legislature has chosen to fund the Oregon Department of Energy. According to statute, in determining the amount of revenues that must be derived from the energy supplier assessment, the director takes into account all other known and readily ascertainable sources of revenue to the Energy Facility Siting Council and to the department, including other sources that you see on this slide. We go on to the next slide. This is a chart of how each of the revenue sources fund the agency's operating budget. This chart doesn't include the SELT program or incentive special payments, or I should say the bonding and incentive special payments, which are passed through the agency and are not part of our operating budget, we talked about before. Charges for services include the public purpose charge, money from the Bonneville Power Administration for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council members, and other fees for work we do with NEA and Energy Northwest Nuclear Plant. Other revenue includes third-party reimbursement, interest for the interest from the Red Grant program, and funding for positions associated with our incentive programs and other positions that have been funded with general fund. I'll stop here to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Michael. There's no questions in the chat yet, and I'm looking to see there's not any hands raised yet, but we can give folks a couple seconds here to think about whether they want to raise their hand or have any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any yet, so I think you're good to go.
All right. So next we'll walk through the agency's request budget and including our policy option packages by program division. But first, here's a slide that provides a high-level look of how our agency is organized and the boards and commissions that we support or oversee us. We'll spend some time going into detail on each program division, so kind of in the interest of that time, I'm going to move on. But if you have any questions as we go through the chat, through the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. So here is an accounting of the agency's budget components and a projection of the ESA needed to fund each of them. This slide is for the entire agency and will be followed by similar breakdown for each division program. I'll spend some time going over this chart to ground everyone for the remaining charts. And the main components are personal services, services and supplies, special payments, and debt service. And you also see our internal general fund transfers that I spoke about earlier. As you recall from the earlier slide, personal services are related to employee costs. Services and supplies, or S&S, are operational expenditures and can include things such as training, travel, professional services. Special payments are transfers and payments for goods or services where ODOE is not the primary beneficiary. And that can include incentive payments, intra-agency transfers between other state agencies. And also paying contributions, loans, the internal general fund transfers represents that technical budget accounting adjustment I mentioned earlier. And you will notice that in the couple of things to notice on this chart here is that in the 1921 travel actuals are down because of the pandemic. But like probably many of you, we are seeing a return to in-person meetings, training, and business travel. You'll also notice that there's a rise in special payments in the incentive programs, and that's from the programs the legislature established at ODOE in the last biennium, and that we anticipate continuing into the 23-25 biennium. Debt service, as you can see, has declined and will continue to decline each biennium since the SELP program is no longer active as we continue to pay down those bonds. And on the right-hand side of the chart, you see how much ESA we are projecting to need to fund each category on here. And as you can see on that total row, the ESA is 13% of the overall budget that we have at ODOE, and shrinks as we take out the internal general fund transfers. So before we go on, are there any questions about this chart before we go into the program specific breakdowns?
Thanks, Michael. I'm not seeing anything in the chat quite yet, but can give folks a couple seconds to think about if they have any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions in the chat. Go ahead.
All right, so we're starting with the Energy Planning and Innovation Division, and we'll follow this model for the rest of the division programs. For each program, we'll start with an overview of that division and program and some of its highlights. I won't read this word for word, but the work of this division supports energy efficiency, renewable energy, sustainable transportation, climate change, and resilience. The agency request budget for P&I includes 26 staff and full-time equivalent or FTE positions. We have a similar slide for each division. Please note this is the count at ARB, which will include the positions of any proposed policy option packages, which we'll discuss in just a moment. This division is made up of two sections, the energy efficiency and conservation section and technology and policy. The two members of Oregon members of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council are also funded by the Bonneville Power Administration as a pass-through in ODOE's budget and show up here. Let's see. This slide shows the budget breakdown by program and activities of the division, and on the right side it shows the revenue resources that support those activities. The graph on the left is an estimate based on the expenditures in the areas in previous years and a projection of what will be spent in this biennium. You can see the majority of the funding for this program, for this division, comes from ESA, with federal funds and public purpose charge school funding making up most of the rest. So here's a multi-biennial look at overall for P&I and its ESA impact. Again, on the right side, you'll see how much ESA we anticipate needing to fund P&I, the policy innovation in our agency request budget. And again, that percentage of ESA is what percentage of the department is funded by ESA. And the one thing you might note here is there's on some of these charts is there's an increase in Attorney General fees, which is due to an increase in fees that the agency is being charged by the Oregon Department of Justice, and as part of the inflation factor included in our budget instructions. And again, this is the same information but broken down by programs, and you'll see that ESA makes up most of the energy, technology, and policy section and a little over half of the energy efficiency and conservation section. You also notice that the Northwest Power and Conservation Council shows 0 under ESA as it is supported because it is receives federal funding from Bonneville Power. Are there questions on this chart?
Hey, Michael, I don't see any questions yet, but we have been alerted to a setting that I think we were just able to change where people were not able to chat to everyone, just to panelists. So sorry about that. We're using a different WebEx platform than we normally do. But if folks were not able to chat their introductions to everyone because we had the everyone option turned off, sorry about that. And please go ahead and feel free to make your introductions in the chat. If you did it before, the panelists were able to see it and we appreciated it. But if you want to introduce yourself to everyone, that would be fantastic. Ruchi, anything to add on that?
Nope, I think that's great. I'm not seeing any questions either as a panelist.
We can give everyone a minute for that, or if there are other questions.
All right, thanks, Alan. Looks like Alan was able to chat to everyone. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions for you, Michael, so
All right.
go ahead.
So now let's talk about some of our exciting policy option packages that ODOE is proposing to further state energy goals and enhance the services we provide to Oregonians. I'll ask my colleague to put a link of the one-page summaries of the policy option packages that we shared at the Energy Advisor Work Group in the chat. We'll start out with two policy option packages in P&I. Currently, ODOE conducts nearly all of its GIS-based analysis using internal staff expertise, and they have had to learn the basics of GIS work out of necessity or on personal time for their own knowledge. GIS-based analysis is a highly technical skill set with the skills developed as part of 2 or 4-year college degree programs or a formalized training module through work or other relevant coursework. And GIS is becoming more of a standard, and it's particularly relevant to energy related information, such as where EVs are registered that we used in our EV vehicle map in COU territories, to assessing demographic data with energy consumption types, assessing climate impacts across geographic areas, or mapping renewable energy resources across the state, as we've done in some of our other studies. This POP would provide funding for a full-time research analyst with GIS expertise. The position would be funded by a combination of federal and general fund, as well as ESA, aligning with the type of work this position would be doing in support of the agency's activities funded by each of those sources. So the next POP is for an energy research fund to supplement research and analysis where ODOE does not have staff or expertise. The energy landscape is evolving quickly as the state works towards achieving its clean energy and climate goals. ODOE does have a small staff of energy analysts who maintain expertise on fundamental and underlying energy issues, and these staff conduct nearly all of the analysis and studies without the benefit of the models and licenses frequently used in the energy sector. It would be inefficient and cost-prohibitive to maintain the internal staff capacity and knowledge on everything in this fast-moving field with new technology that develops so quickly. So in recent years, the agency has identified areas where our work would be enhanced and be more useful by working with external expertise. This policy option package would establish an energy research fund at the agency that will be used to contract with outside firms for studies, research, or analysis when necessary to supplement the existing department resources. The amount is $250,000, is anticipated to cover the cost of 1 to 4 studies per biennium. This POP is, and I just wanted to call out that this policy option package is in the agency request budget as an ESA other funds ask, but in response to feedback that we received from the Energy Advisor Work Group, ODOE plans to switch this request when we receive additional state energy program money later this year under the IIJA Act. This means that the projected ESA need you see today, which is already lower than what we presented to you at the current service level, when we showed you the current service level in June, will be lower still in preparation of the governor's recommended budget. And again, I think this could be a good time to stop and see if there are any questions about P&I, about the P&I budget.
Thanks, Michael. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet.
I'm hoping the raised hand function works.
I know.
Somebody wants to raise their hand and tell us that it's working, that would be great. Either that or everyone's just quiet and.
Oh, I see Brooke. Thank you, Brooke. And Mary, for a second, they put their hands down, so we did see them.
Okay, good. Phew, thank you. We're making good time here too, so looks like we will have some time at the end for questions.
Great. And I do see a question from Laura in the chat about whether ODO has some specific studies in mind for the research fund. If Janine or Michael want to take a shot at that.
Sure, Laura, thank you for the question. We do have some specific ideas on topics, not necessarily specific studies in mind yet. And this POP actually envisions us working with the Energy Advisory Work Group to come up with studies that would benefit existing work, wouldn't be duplicative of other work that's being undertaken in the state. There are a number of areas where we have identified in the past through the biennial energy report and in some of the other reports we've been doing for the legislature where we'd like to seek additional information. We don't have that expertise in-house. So that would be the type of studies that we would be pursuing. But I actually think that Jessica Rikers is on the call. And Jessica, if you have anything you'd like to add in terms of studies we would be funding with the Energy Research Fund, go ahead.
Thanks, Janine. I think you hit most of the ones we've been thinking about. I would just add that we do get requests regularly from our stakeholders in different meetings about studies that they would like us to consider. And this would be the kind of thing that would enable us to be a little more nimble when we get those requests of putting them in front of the Energy Advisory Working Group and sort of doing that quick assessment on whether or not it's something that we think would be helpful to do quicker, sooner rather than later. So.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Laura, hopefully that answered your question. And I'm hearing that maybe the chatting to all, everyone is not working again. So sorry about that, but we are able to see your questions that come in to all panelists, and we're happy to read those out so everyone can hear what's being asked. Were there any other questions, folks with their hands up, Ruchi, that you noticed?
I think I do see a hand up, but Stacy confirms that might just be a testing hand and not a real question. But Adam, if you would like us to unmute you, or if you have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions if they're not just testing the hand thing.
Okay, glad to know it works. Thank you. And we're going to keep working on that chatting to everyone option. Okay, Michael, back to you.
All right, thank you. So now we'll move on to the Energy Development Services division, and this division's probably seen the most change from 2 years ago, where it was primarily tasked with administering inactive or sunsetting programs to standing up new programs and extending the Oregon Solar Plus Storage Rebate program. So the division now administers 4 incentive programs in addition to the legacy tax credit and lending programs that are no longer active. Again, just some highlights that I won't read word for word. I could go for the next slide. So this division has 21 staff and represents 18.39 FTE. And the FTE count is slightly smaller and is adjusted for positions that are only proposed for part of the biennium or that are part-time positions. We have part-time position in accounting related to this program. So here's the EDS budget breakdown, and it's funded by General Fund for Incentive Programs, self-loan repayments, along with a small amount of lottery fund dollars to repay bonds for the inactive energy efficiency finance program, and a little bit of grant interest fees here. So this one's pretty straightforward. And so again, here's a division overview, and I won't spend too much time on these unless there are questions, but you can see that this division has no ESA support. So this is where, again, kind of the breakdown. This is where you'll find most of our special payments in the incentive programs. And you'll also see that there's, again, no ESA support for this division. And in case you're wondering, the residual amounts in the energy efficiency S&S are just kind of carry over and will eventually be phased out. Now I'll talk about the policy option packages for this division. So the first, and as I mentioned before, we did have to phase out most of our incentives and use policy option packages to phase them back in.
Hey, Michael.
Yes.
We had a question come in. There were a few mentions of funding that ODOE receives from BPA. I think it's important that ODOE recognize that those funds come primarily from COUs who also pay the ESA. Yes, thank you, Tom, for pointing that out. That is how Bonneville receives its revenues, and Bonneville does fund the Northwest Power and Conservation Council members. Also a reminder that if you send a question to all panelists, we'll see it faster than sending it to the host. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for that.
Sorry, Michael, seeing a couple more questions coming in now.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Peggy is asking about, back on slide 18, the Oregon Global Warming Commission. Is there an increase in staffing and research for the Oregon Global Warming Commission? Happy to go back to slide 18, but the answer is no, the agency request budget does not specifically seek additional funding for the Oregon Global Warming Commission, but we are in conversations with the legislature about the needs for that commission, and assume that some of the additional resources here will help the work that the Global Warming Commission does as well, but it will be specifically for ODOE. Hope that answered your question, Peggy. All right, going back to, which slide were we on?
The OSSRP slide, the first policy option package.
Thank you. Oh, and I see that Peggy was able to chat to everyone, so sounds like that is working now. Thank you.
All right, so this first POP in the Energy Development Services is to continue funding for the award-winning Oregon Solar and Oregon Solar Plus Storage Rebate Program for an additional 5 years at a cost of $10 million in general fund. So, our second POP has to do with the Energy Efficient Wildfire Rebuilding Incentive Program, which we launched back in April. And it is a general fund program that has reserved over $500,000 in incentives for 81 wildfire survivors who are looking to rebuild more energy efficiently, and another over 150 applications in progress. We're not proposing to add new money to this program, just to allow another few years to the existing funds, as the wildfire survivors won't be ready to rebuild by the end of this biennium. And then our third pop is for extending funding and staffing for 2 new heat pump incentive programs that the legislature authorized a few months ago, just earlier this year. One of these programs will provide funding to regional entities to establish heat pump distribution programs, and one will provide incentives for the installation of heat pumps in rental properties. Again, these are general fund programs. So those are the 3 policy option packages being proposed in the Energy Development Services Division. Does anyone have any questions about EDS?
I'm not seeing any. Ruchi, are you seeing any questions?
No, and no hands raised yet either.
All right. We'll just keep going then, and just definitely feel free to chime in with questions as you have them. So the Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness Division represents Oregon's interest in the Hanford nuclear facility cleanup, manages our radioactive waste disposal regulations, and prepares for nuclear-related emergencies, and also leads the state's energy security planning. This division, sorry, give a second for the slides to get there. This division has 6 FTE and positions, so it's pretty stable. So on the next slide, we'll talk about how the Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness, or NSEP, is primarily supported with grants from US DOE for the work on Hanford cleanup. The program also receives fees from radioactive waste haulers. And ESA resources are used to support some of ODOE's work in emergency preparedness, such as the fuel action plan or fuel action planning. I will note that ESA was used to support ODOE's work on in-state radioactive waste oversight, but in the current biennium, ODOE requested and the legislature approved shifting that to general fund. And this budget continues and expands the general fund support for in-state radioactive waste oversight. That's a need we anticipate continuing into the next biennium. So next is a breakdown of the nuclear safety and emergency preparedness budget. Again, kind of probably looking familiar by now, but this is by the personal services, special services, and their special payments are payments made to Oregon Health Authority and Oregon State University for helping with emergency preparedness trainings. And again, as I was saying, in our agency request budget, ODOE is proposing to increase the general fund support for radioactive waste disposal, monitoring, and oversight. This increase will support additional work to monitor radioactive waste in the state and work with waste managers to ensure that they understand and are following the laws. So are there any questions about this division or program?
Michael, I don't see any questions about nuclear safety, but a question did come in about the incentive programs. Do you expect the heat pump program to roll out this fall? I think the answer is probably closer to next spring. The legislation passed in earlier this year in the 2022 legislative session, and that once it passed, we then started hiring staff, and we're still working on that so that we can design and launch the program.
Yes. Yeah, we are working on that, working through onboarding or recruiting the staff, getting their rulemaking, working with our partners to identify how to best parameters for operating both of those programs.
Any other questions?
All right.
Okay.
So next is the Energy Facility Siting Division, and it's one of ODOE's primary statutory responsibilities to ensure that proposed energy facilities meet specific statewide and local standards and are considered with public input and participation. This division is seeing an uptick in proposed projects and amendments over the last few years, leading to an increased workload for the team and for the Energy Facility Siting Council. The Siting Division, go to the next one here. The Siting Division has 13 staff and FTE. There are currently 5 siting analysts that evaluate proposed projects on focus on oversight and monitoring. And this slide includes the 2 additional positions that we are proposing in the policy option package, which I will talk about in a minute. So energy facility siting is primarily funded by fees, developer fees seeking a permit. These fees are set on a cost recovery basis and therefore are unique to each project. You'll see that ESA covers some of the costs of ODOE's siting work, and this is by statute. The ESA covers work that can be charged, that can't be charged to developers, but which supports the work of the division and the agency. This can include non-project specific costs like rulemaking and non-siting tasks like legislative testimony, budget preparation, and strategic planning. And if we go into the next chart, hopefully this is all starting to look kind of familiar by now, but here is the breakdown for siting. Please note this includes the cost of supporting the Energy Facility Siting Council, and also includes in special payments costs to reviewing agencies, other state agencies, and other authorities for reviewing siting projects. Applications. So in siting, we have so we've kind of mentioned several times, we'll be proposing a new policy option package. And like the 2 prior biennium, and due to the increased workload with new and amended projects, the agency is seeking authority to bring on 2 positions in the siting division if the workload requires it. This policy option package has been reduced from 3 staff to 2 due to feedback that we received from the Energy Advisor Work Group, from ESA payers at the Energy Advisor Work Group meeting in June. I would also like to take this opportunity to point out how things are reflected at different phases in our budget. So this request essentially is asking to continue positions from the current biennium because they were limited duration positions. We are required to phase them out at the current service level budget, which means that we need to phase them back in using a policy option package. But in this case, we're not asking for more staff than we are currently authorized for. These positions, again, will only be filled when we feel that we can bill. We have a target goal of 80% of the position or more to the cost of projects. And we did use some of this resource in the current biennium as projects, especially solar facilities, are on the uptick. We anticipate the need for the foreseeable future. So again, we'll be asking that these positions be made permanent. Are there any questions about the siting programs or divisions before I move on?
Not seeing any in the chat. Thank you, Jenny, for putting a link to the monthly updates for the Energy Facility Siting Division in the chat. You can keep up to speed on all the projects that they're considering.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any raised hands either yet.
All right.
All right, so that brings us to the Administrative Services Division, which includes the Director's Office and Central Services. The Director's Office employees provide resources and services for the entire agency, including audit, communication, public records request, strategic engagement with stakeholders and citizens and elected officials. And Central Services handles our business support functions, including payroll, contracts and procurement, grant management, budget and accounting, information technology, and other agency-wide services. When we're looking at this, the Director's Office, looking at the positions here. Next. The Director's Office has 13 staff in FTE, and this includes 4 FTE for policy option package that I'll speak about shortly. And on the Central Services side, we have 23 staff and FTE. And I'll also note that here, Human Resources is budgeted under Central Services, but it reports to the Director's Office operationally. All right. So the administrative service function is funded mostly through indirect rate, which is supported by each of our funding sources, including ESA. It is also supported directly by ESA and other funds. Here, note that ESA also contributes to the indirect rate. The percentage of ESA funding, the Administrative Service Division, is higher than 25%. And that will be reflected in the next slide. So one more time, this is a breakdown for the division, and notice that the ESA is higher than the previous chart because of its contributions to the indirect rate. And here's a breakdown of Central Services in the Director's Office. And the special payments in the Director's Office in the 19 and 21 biennium were due to special payments related to a DoD grant to other agencies. So, and now on this slide,
Hey, Michael, do you think that it might be a good chance to pause for some questions that we've seen?
yeah, sure.
Okay, great. There was a question that Mike sent over in the chat about using general fund instead of ESA for the non-fee expenses of the siting program. And then after that, there's a question from Peggy that we can address. Do Janine or Michael, one of you want to talk about Mike's question?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a shot at that. Thanks for the question. So most of the work, as Michael mentioned, of the siting division is funded by fees on developers who are seeking new site certificates and amendments. And developer fees can also cover some of the costs of non-project specific work, but there's a statutory cap on how much we can charge developers for that work. So statute now then requires us to look to ESA for that funding for the remainder of non-project specific costs and non-siting specific costs. So the short answer is, again, that's how the legislature has chosen to fund the department and the council, and we're not authorized to use general fund for that. I know Todd Cornett from the Siting Division is on the line. Todd, if you have anything else to answer or anything else to add, go ahead.
Thanks, Janine. No, I think you hit it exactly correct. So I don't have anything to add to that unless there's any more specific questions.
If there is interest, we do have that chart, Todd, that you prepared that we shared at the Energy Advisory Work Group meeting. If we want to go to that. Maybe I'll look to Mike to see if you want further elaboration on funding for the siting division. Okay, why don't I take Peggy's question, and then Mike, if you want to just put that in all panelists, we can see and come back to that. So Peggy's question in the chat: with money from the feds, will ODO have enough staff to follow the money in grant requests and monitoring if you get money? Yes and no, Peggy. Thanks for the question. We do have a federal grants coordinator who works on our budget team, who's been following all of the IIJA funding and helps us with our state energy program and our Hanford grant. And she is spending a lot of time right now monitoring all of the opportunities that could be in front of us with that IIJA funding. And she hosted actually 2 public webinars on IIJA funding last week and the week before. But there are programs that will be sending money to us from the feds where we will need to hire staff to help administer those. For example, there's a funding opportunity announcement out right now for grid resilience funding that will bring $10 million into the state every year. And if let's see, we'll bring money into the state every year, and ODO will be then turning around and using that money to fund resilience projects. And so we'll need to bring in a staff person to help us do that. And there may be other funding streams from the IIJA bill that will require us to hire additional staff as well. But we're doing what we can with the existing staff. Are there other federal agencies where we might be missing money without more staff? It's a really good question. I think that Jen has done a pretty good job, our federal grants coordinator, of keeping her eye open for all those opportunities. And we are also members of the National Association of State Energy Officials, which really has their finger on the pulse of federal funding. But I think we may, just depending on the federal funds that come to us, might need additional resources. Michael, Ruchi, do you have anything else to share there?
I'll just share that maybe that when we do get the funding, as we mentioned, we can't build it until it's available into the budget, and we can look for adding positions using the funding at that time, depending on particular grant and what it allows for administrative oversight or kind of an administrative expense. And also on the question is you might be teeing us up good for one of the policy option packages that we're about to talk about, which would be helping not necessarily ODO, but others in the state identify where there's funding to help with their energy projects.
Great point. And I think, Peggy, the leaving federal money on the table, that's part of the concern for sure. And I think that we're sort of more concerned about that from a local government perspective, for communities that don't have the capacity to seek out and monitor the funding opportunities and do the applications. So that's where the policy package that Michael referenced will come into play. And I should point out that ODO is also a member of the governor's infrastructure cabinet, which meets every couple of weeks to talk about the opportunities that there are. So we are in the loop, for example, with ODOT on funding from the Department of Transportation for electric vehicles. All right.
All right. So if there are no more questions right now, and obviously feel free to add them as they come in. But ODO will be proposing 3 policy option package in the Administrative Services Division, and each of these takes a different approach to increase ODO's engagement and outreach with Oregonians. The first would fund paid student workers. ODO has long offered unpaid internships, but we know that not everyone has the ability to participate in an unpaid internship. This POP would allow ODOE to increase the pool of candidates and provide a more equitable intern experience. This POP would fund 2 positions, which would support 12 part-time paid interns over the course of the biennium. And ODOE is proposing that this POP with general fund be funded general fund. Our next POP is for a public advocate and will allow ODOE to build upon its outreach to environmental justice communities and to address barriers identified in our work with the EJ Council, the Environmental Justice Council. We have found that our work is better when we are able to meaningfully incorporate thoughtful input and feedback from environmental justice communities and other underrepresented communities and individuals, including tribes and rural communities. This POP builds on existing work and also reflects the need for new capacity. Because much of the work of this position would be supported by general fund and federally funded programs, we are proposing that only a third of it be covered by ESA. And finally, we have a POP that would help build local capacity within the state by providing services to help communities identify and get funding for their energy projects. We've heard a lot about this and this need for this type of service in our recent public webinars on federal funding. And I'll ask my colleague Jenny to put a link to those webinars in the chat if she can. And this budget ask would support also supports a legislative concept that the agency is proposing to establish a community capacity building program to support our rural, tribal, and other environmental justice communities as they seek state and federal funding. And this POP would be funded with general fund. So those are the 3 slides that are the 3 POPs that we have for the Administrative Services Division. So I'll just pause here to see if there are any questions about policy option packages or the budget components that we just reviewed.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet or raised hands. Just pause for a minute to see if Stacy is seeing any as the host. Nope, Stacy's not seeing any either. So go ahead, Michael.
All right. So here we're looking at a summary of everything we just went through. And this is pretty much how we expect to spend and what we expect to spend on each program division, including the percentages that each program would be covered with ESA. So for example, in that top line, 73% of the director's office expenses would be covered by ESA, and 48% ESA would cover 48% of central services. And there's a lot on this chart, so I'll wait a minute here to let people review the chart and see if there are any questions. Just give that a minute. So, I don't know if anyone is seeing questions in the chat or.
Nope.
Okay. So we'll go on to the next slide. But again, if you come up with a question later, feel free to pop it in the chat or raise your hand. So here, as you're probably familiar from building your own budget, scenario planning is an important part of the budget development process, with considerations about how to operate in different environments. As part of the state budget process, agencies prepare 5 and 10% budget cut lists, which outline how each agency plans to respond to a reduction in revenue. Agencies are required to develop this list by each fund type they receive, and this is a summary of ODO's reduction targets. On the top of this chart, you'll see a budget for each division under the sale package, and on the bottom, you'll see the target for each fund type. The reduction targets shows how much we would be cutting under each of those scenarios. Note on this chart, other funds is sometimes included in general funds due to the internal agency transfers we mentioned earlier. And you'll notice that in EDS. We'll be submitting a, and again, in this example, you'll see like in P&I at 10%, we'd have to total budget of other funds of $6.97 million. We'd have to cut $697,000 at the 10% cut list, and you see that all rolled up at the end there. And so we'll be submitting a more detailed cut list with our agency request budget and can share for those of you who are interested. But I'll pause here to see if there are any questions. Great, sounds like everyone's following along, hopefully, and getting it, so that's great. And so now we'll just have a few slides talking specifically about the energy supplier assessment. The energy supplier assessment is established by statute, which is ORS 469.4218 for anyone interested, and is the method by which a legislator has chosen to cover most of the operating budget of ODO. This fee is charged to fuel providers and utilities producing energy in Oregon who pass the cost on to their customers. The ESA is assessed on ratepayers' gross operating revenues and is capped at 0.375% of revenue. The ESA under this budget would be much less than that. We won't know the exact number until the budget and the ESA payer revenues are final the next year. But in 2022, that ESA rate was under 0.13%. So under the cap. So here's a history of the ESA by biennia for the last decade. And as you can see from this chart, ODO has tried to maintain stability in the supplier assessment, even as the makeup and responsibilities of the agency continually evolve. You can also see that the 23-25 agency request budget will result in an assessment of $6.69 million for the next biennium. Remember, this figure could change as we go through the budget process. The next chart shows the ESA in relation to the energy supply revenue for the last 10 years. Supply revenue is reported in billions of dollars using the left axis, while the assessment is reported in millions of dollars on the right. The top orange line is the total revenue by all ESA payers, while the other lines, such as the yellow natural gas revenue line, are by supplier type. And the blue, it represents COU revenue. And you'll note that there has been an increase in revenue across all electricity suppliers since 2020. In the next slide, during our discussions in the June EAWG meeting, I talked about how our budget and its ESA impact would change from the current service level presented at that meeting to our agency request budget we're presenting today, with the expectation that the addition of our policy option packages would reduce the ESA impact. This is because the additional positions in our policy option packages help spread the cost of our indirect pool to other funding streams. As you saw earlier, we adjusted our policy option packages in the siting division to only ask for the 2 positions authorized for the current biennium instead of the 3 positions that were presented at the Energy Advisor Work Group. Based on that feedback. And today we've also indicated that we planned to fund the Energy Research Fund with federal funds that we expect to receive later this year. But since we cannot build that into the budget at this time, we'll have to ask for that switch later. And when that happens, we will work with the CFO and Legislative Fiscal Office to shift the funding on this policy option package for the Energy Research Fund. And this chart shows how those actions will impact ESA in the next biennium if ODOE's budget is approved as proposed. I want to stress again that our budget and its ESA impact can and will change as it goes through the governor's office and then on to the legislature. This is the best estimate we can currently provide, but it is likely to change. And there are, and so as you can see here, these are our projections in the change from CSL to ARB, and then what we, again, right now might project is if accepted as proposed in the governor's budget. Are there any questions about the projected revenue need to fund our programs or the projected allocation of funds derived from ESA in this budget?
I'm not seeing any questions, Michael.
All right.
Great, so we're almost done and we can just open it up for any questions on any of this as soon as you're done. Oh, I see that Peggy asks if we have a priority list for our POPs. Peggy, you're asking me to choose between my children. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. That's a really good question.
And I think we have plenty of policy option packages in here that we're pretty excited about. I think the extended incentive programs, which are essentially rolling over funds that have already been provided but need additional legislative action, are some priority ones. But the other ones, yeah, it's like Janine said, it's hard to choose.
I will add that we did have a number of POP ideas that came up through the agency internally, and the ones that we brought to the Energy Advisory Work Group and then are submitting as part of our agency request budget are a small portion of the ones that we, the ones that our staff identified as needs. So I would say what you're seeing are the priorities. And, you know, we haven't really developed a priority list. We will need to come forward as we talk to the CFO and the new budget with what the priorities are. So I think we're very interested in feedback on what you all think are the most important priorities for these POPs.
All right. All right, so thanks for going through that. And so where do we go from here? So ODOE will submit our agency request budget to the state's Chief Financial Office next week, and they will work with the governor to review ODOE's ARB along with the request budgets of other state agencies and consolidate them into the governor's recommended budget, which will be provided to the legislature sometime in early 2023. The legislature will then determine ODOE's budget during the 2023 session, and the legislative process will include hearings on ODOE's budget and Ways and Means, and that will include public comment in multiple formats. In addition to our budget bill, there are other actions, as flagged, there are other actions taken during session that may impact the agency and ODOE's ultimate legislatively approved budget. The adopted budget, sorry. So here are just some links to documents that can provide more information on how the budget and the legislative concepts are developed. And we will be posting our final agency request budget on the on our budget website with all the supporting documentation after submitting it to the CFO.
So I'm seeing a question from Peggy. Will the current governor's recommendations be public even as there will be a new governor to do the official GRB? I think the answer to that is no, but I am not 100% certain. And I think we have Sione on the line if he wants to correct me, or maybe Michael, you know.
Well, if Sione's on the line, he can definitely chime in, but my understanding is that that the CFO's office will be working with the incoming governor to develop a governor's recommended budget. And that it, in years where an administration isn't changing the governor's recommended budget, it's actually often released in December. And this extra time is to account to give the new administration time to set their priorities and adjust the budget according to that.
Great. So now we have lots of time for questions. Oh, Michael, did you have one more slide? There you go.
Yeah, no, that was this is just the end slide. That was a lot of slides and a lot of information. So just wanted to thank everyone for their time and for the questions that we did get in. I hope that, if there are more questions, feel free to ask them. I hope, and our goal today was for you to walk away with a better understanding of the Oregon Department of Energy and how our programs support the state's energy goals, how our budget is developed to support those goals, and the role that the energy supplier assessment plays in funding the department. So we definitely have some time, but so if you have a question about what you've seen today or the budget process, feel free to raise your hand or ask a question in the chat. And also feel free to reach out to me directly today or as we move through the budget process. So I'll just pause again to see if we have any more great questions.
I would like to go back to a question that Mike Freese asked, because Mike, I think you asked a question and I think I responded in the chat, but you might have left and come back on your phone, so you might have seen it. Mike had a question about statute and funding for the Energy Facility Siting Division, and I shared that the statute is 469.421, Section 8A. And we have an extra slide on here that we shared at the Energy Advisory Work Group meeting that describes how the siting division is funded. And here is where you can see that where we can, the non-project specific costs are allocated to developer fees. Where we can't, the statute sends us to the ESA. So please go ahead, Mike, and raise your hand if you want to talk about it further, or feel free to follow up with additional questions. We are happy to stay on the line for longer if people want to think about the questions that they might have, or just you're shy and it takes you a little bit of time to raise your hand, or we are happy to wait. And Jenny just put a link to our online portal and the email address, askenergy@energy.oregon.gov. It also works if you send it to askenergy@oregon.gov. We are always here and happy to supply any information you would like about our budget.
If there are other questions, happy to hang out for a couple more minutes, but case anyone's hopping off, they just want to say thank you again for taking the time to review the budget and learn more about our process and bring any questions you have. Hope you have a great evening.
I echo Michael's thanks. Appreciate your engagement. And we'll just wait here for a few more minutes in case someone wants to raise their hand or drop a question in the chat. Just a reminder to ask the question to all panelists or everyone so that we can all see it. Okay. I think it's safe to say no one has any further questions. And if you do, you know how to get in touch with us. So again, thanks for being part of this meeting, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on our budget. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, have a good night, everyone. Bye.